Okay, so there's a lot of hubbub about alternatives to YouTube because of a video that YouTube made. YouTube made a video. I think it was talking about it was called YouTube Heroes or something stupid. Basically, they're gonna start flagging shit, and they're gonna start cracking down on hate speech, or at least that's what they said. Now, I've seen this before. I've seen them do this with the SPLC and the Jewish Internet Defense Force. This seems like there's a bit more muscle behind it than those things, but my stance is let's not shit ourselves until things actually start happening. But people are talking about a response to this is like we need some sort of alternative to YouTube. We need to sort of avoid, being ghettoized in what is now we could call legacy social media. Like there's legacy mass media, but now we're looking at legacy social media. And so they're talking about like alternatives to YouTube. And I've seen attempts at alternatives to YouTube and they all fail. And they all fail for a few reasons. One is the network effects of social networks. Like when you have a social network, people want to go to a social network because the people are there. And so the more people go to a social network, the more valuable it becomes. And so it becomes self-reinforcing. Now, as a result, the social networks can get away with a lot of really nasty shit. Like Facebook can, screw around with your feed priority. Screw around with what posts you see. They basically like screw around with you. They're able to get away with a lot of stuff because where else are you going to go? Like no individual can really go anywhere else because Facebook is where all the people are. Right, and people want to go to social networks because that's where the other people are. That's the whole point of the social network is the other people. So in order to for a social network to crack up, they have to do something really bad, or there has to be a really concerted effort among users to move to other platforms. And it has to be led by like a sort of a cartel of really big, power users. Like for YouTube, PewDiePie, and like a whole bunch of other really large channels would have to get together and say, hey, we're all going to a new site. Okay, that's what they would have to do. That's what they would have to do. But another thing, though, is that YouTube may ghettoize political content because it doesn't make YouTube a whole lot of money and it causes a lot of grief. So YouTube may ghettoize political content. And what this does, though, what this would do is that actually creates a sort of a smaller market, but it would create an opportunity for people who want to create political content to go to some other site, because that would be sort of their niche. Is that we won't suppress your content like these other sites will be. We won't suppress political content. You can post videos here on this site without being, slammed in the search and stuff. And as a result, you may be more likely to get views on our platform than you would on YouTube. And so YouTube may actually just sort of expunge political content from their site themselves. And as a result, you don't need to have like the biggest users on YouTube to move to another site. You wouldn't need that because because a particular kind of content would be effectively disallowed on YouTube, and so if you want to have a certain kind of content, basically we're dealing in a completely different market at that point, a kind of market that YouTube isn't even in anymore, which is political content, and so political content would go on another site, right? And so that would, and so the network effects advantage that YouTube has over basically any other video site would disappear if YouTube makes the decision to expunge political content. And so political content could go to another platform because, there's no network effect advantage of making political content on YouTube if YouTube isn't going to allow you effectively. Now, it's a bit more complicated than this because it's not quite so clear cut as whether or not they're allowing political content or not. They may be sort of allowing it, but not quite. It's maybe sort of a muddled area as to whether or not they're allowing political content. But, if they could be making the situation bad enough that there becomes that going to another site becomes better than the network effects advantage of YouTube, especially if YouTube is doing things to prevent political content from having any network effects advantage. If they're basically barring you from having any network effect benefits at all, then then there's really no point in going on to YouTube because you don't get access to all those users. So that's sort of the issue with the network effects, and like I've seen, and so that's one problem. But YouTube looks like they may be helping us out a little bit on that side, on the network effects problem, by basically denying us, their network. So and thus making YouTube no longer competitive for political speech. Then there's the other issue, which is money. These sites, once they get to a certain size, their expenses are going to start to go up quite a bit, and all this bandwidth, all this downloads, and like most people aren't paying, they're not going to pay anything. So don't even start with that. Don't get that idea that people are going to start paying a whole bunch of money as the site gets bigger. No, you got a few dedicated people who pay money at the founders, but as the site gets bigger and bigger and bigger, the proportion of users to people willing to pay money gets worse and worse. You get more users and fewer relative to the number of people who are willing to pay money, and so you get scaling problems. And with YouTube, what Google did was they just ate those costs. Google had so much money from Google search that they were just able to eat the cost of YouTube for a very long time. They're able to eat, I don't know exactly how much it was, but I'm sure it was well over $10 million a year. Maybe more than that. It's like $100 million, like a ton of money. They were willing to eat those costs. That's the point. Whereas sort of a new alternative media site is not going to be able to eat those costs. So that's where this site called BitChute comes in. Okay, and there's two good things about the site BitChute. The first is that it is there's two things about it, like on the ideological side and on the scaling side. So on the scaling side, BitChute it's a torrent based site. It's basically like a video torrent based site. For people who don't know what torrents are, I think most people listening to this are going to know what a torrent is. But basically, a torrent is you get a little file. It's called the torrent, and it's just a marker, right? It's a marker for a file, for the file that you want to download. Like the torrent marker, it's like a string of numbers, and it refers to some program that you want, like some video game. And if you have this string of numbers, you have a client, the BitTorrent client, and other people using that client, if they have that file, you can download that file from them, right? As long as you have like the torrent marker, and anybody can get like a torrent, can get these torrent markers. So what you do is you sort of connect to the client, and any torrent and any file that you have can be downloaded by other people from your computer, right? They can download it from you. You can download stuff from them. And as a result, you don't strain any particular server somewhere where everybody's trying to download from a single centralized server. That the load of uploading and downloading gets distributed among thousands of users. And that's the idea of this site, BitChute, is that the videos, of course, they're uploaded to a central server, right? So if there's a video that there are no other users who have it on their computer, who have that video on their computer, you can't download it from them, so you just sort of download it from the server. That's obviously going to have to exist, and certainly going to have to exist at the beginning, because when a video first gets uploaded, no user has the file, right? Because the file literally went from from one guy's computer to the server, and that guy may or may not be online at the moment. So at the beginning, of course, any video has to be sort of downloaded. But as the video gets popular, especially like the really popular videos, there's going to be people logged in that have that video on their hard drive, and so you can just download it from them, right? And so that's the idea of BitChute is that the cost of uploading and downloading is offloaded to everyone else. And so that gives me confidence that as the site scales, that as the site gets bigger and bigger and bigger, the cost of uploading and downloading is not going to increase linearly. It's not going to increase linearly with the size of the site. And so it is a fundamentally much lower cost program. And in fact, even as the site gets bigger, there would actually be less and less relative server load because you have more and more users. And so for any video, it's more likely that you'll be able to download the video from another user, not from the site. Whereas with YouTube, you're just downloading all the videos from the site. Right? YouTube, it's just as simple. You download the video from the server. Right? It doesn't come from other users. So BitChute like solves the scaling problem very well. Now, there's a lot of people who have problems with torrents. They may have sort of privacy or fear they may get hacked with the torrent stuff. I've been using torrents for over 10 years. I've never had a problem with them in that way. Okay, so that's one reason I like BitChute so much. Another reason I like BitChute is that the founder of BitChute is a fan of the Corbett Report. And in fact, in the FAQ of BitChute, he specifically references the Corbett Report. The Corbett Report is sort of like an Alex Jones-y sort of thing. It's talks about 9/11, talks about false flag attacks, Alex Jones conspiracy guy. I think. I haven't watched the Corbett Report, so I'm sorry if I'm mischaracterizing him. But that's good. Okay, it's not so much that James Corbett, I think, is a white nationalist, but he's not the kind of person that's like, hard on for, that has like some sort of hard on for like for bashing the fash or whatever. Like basically conspiracy type people don't do that. Conspiracy type people are not interested in doing that stuff. So that's what's good. And given that the founder of BitChute is a fan of the Corbett Report, I'm thinking that he's going to be of that mentality as well. Now, so I'm looking at like sort of an alternative to YouTube, and I'm thinking BitChute is likely it, because like there's these other sites that like, they say, yeah, free speech, that's going to be sort of our in, that YouTube is censoring, but we're going to allow free speech. But what they don't get, what these sites don't get, is that they're not understanding the dynamic of free speech. Like, look, let's say you're in the Soviet Union and you have some guy who wants to have free speech in the Soviet Union. Okay, what is free speech in the Soviet? What is the purpose of free speech in the Soviet Union? What's the real issue in the Soviet Union of free speech? It's criticizing communism, criticizing the government and communism, and supporting the free market. Okay, that's what that is the suppressed speech in the Soviet Union. Okay, so when someone says they support free speech in the Soviet Union, the only meaningful thing of free speech in the Soviet Union is the free market. Okay, because if someone's in the Soviet Union saying, well, I'm going to have a platform that allows free speech, and you can say all you want about UFOs, you can say all you want about Bigfoot, right? But you cannot engage in reactionary, anti-worker, anti-human capitalism, anti-human capitalist speech, right? You can't do that. Yeah, it's like you could say that, and would you are you supporting free speech? If you want to say you are, you can say you are or whatever. But look, the point of free speech in the Soviet Union is free markets. It's all about free markets. If you're not when someone says they're an advocate of free speech in the Soviet Union, the only meaningful sense in which you could be an advocate of free speech in the Soviet Union is to support the advocacy of free markets, and in a substantive way too, not just like this. Oh, I'm going to have a platform, and over here in this sort of ghettoized corner of this platform, there's going to be three guys talking about free markets, right? That are sort of going to be sort of hushed away into their little corner. They're not going to be able to really influence anything. Like that's the whole point of free speech is that the new idea wins. If there's no realistic pathway for the new idea to win, then then what's the point, right? So when we're talking about free speech, that's it's a specific thing at any given point in time in history. It's not this. I mean, you could think of it in principle terms, but but when you're dealing with it in reality, it's going to be a real thing. Okay, so like when someone says, "Oh, I support free speech in principle, but I guess I am a little bit less principled and want to put a sort of a halt line on free speech once you get to white nationalism in the U.S." It's like, well, then you're not free speech in any meaningful way. Your free speech means fuck all. Okay, because in the United States today, free speech, like in the Soviet Union, free speech meant capitalism. Okay. In the U.S. today, free speech means white nationalism, because that's the suppressed speech. So basically, when people say, "Oh, I support free speech," for all sorts of things, but I don't support free speech for the oppressed speech of the day, right? And guess what? Most people are not fans of the suppressed speech. Okay, like they're not like if you're in medieval Europe, it's like, I support free speech except for atheism, except for heresy. It's like, well, like free speech in medieval Europe means heresy. It means atheism. That's what it means. All right, nothing else really fucking matters, So, and another thing that like to these platforms that say they want to have the free speech, like, let me tell you a story. Prior to what we call mass media, all white people had views on things that we would call white nationalist. And what I mean by that is that they supported laws against race mixing, and they supported white-only countries, or keeping the country as white as practicable. Okay? Those were two very popular things. In fact, I know of a poll during World War II where the majority of white people in the United States said that they would rather lose the war than end segregation. Okay. Now, talk about what is a lot of people have issue with segregation. That's a terrible thing. Well, look, what was happening in the South is you had two separate nations. You had the whites and the blacks. These were separate nations, and they're still separate nations, and they will always be separate nations because there's a genetic incompatibility. Now, normally, when you have two separate nations in the same political entity, they segregate from each other, right? And it's just like, the Hungarian. Let's say you put the Hungarians and the Romanians in the same country, like some imperial power forced them to be part of the same country. They would segregate from each other. They would have this is like the Romanian area. This is the Hungarian area. This is a Hungarian store, run by Hungarians for Hungarians, Romanians. We don't want your business, right? And it would just be like that, right? That's what would happen normally, and it would be fine. In the South, the whites tried to do that, but there was a constant problem in that the blacks kept trying to get into the white areas, right? Like normally it's just, okay, here's the Korean area, here's the Vietnamese area. They don't particularly like each other. they segregate from each other. It's like, oh, you're a Korean in the Vietnamese area, you probably need to get out of here, or something bad's going to happen to you, and then they leave. Right? That's normal segregation. Problem is, in the South, it's like is you constantly had blacks trying to get into the white areas, and the whites would say, hey, you need to get out of this area or something bad is going to happen to you, right? Because what's happening is that the whites want to be their own country, right? They want to be their own country, politically separate from the blacks. They want to be their own country. They don't want to have a single black person in their country, right? Because they are a separate and distinct nation, a separate and distinct people, okay? But what's happening is that Washington D.C. wasn't allowing them. That's why there's all that hatred for the Yankees, because the Yankees is the foreign political power that's forcing a political union between two distinct nations. Okay, and that's what segregation was. And the blacks kept trying to get into the white areas, and we know why. Right, because when blacks are left to their own devices, they create Africa, they create Detroit, they create Haiti, they create Liberia. Right, we know what happens. So it's obvious what was happening. So what you had was a situation of segregation, but the problem is the economic disparity between the two nations was so severe that one of the nations kept trying to get into white spaces. They kept trying to get into white schools, into white businesses, into white pools, into white residences. And it's like, and the whites were like, gee, get the fuck out. It was just so that was the situation. That was segregation, and it's not that's not something that is at all to any way ideal for a white nationalist. The ideal is full on political separation, right? The ideal is a white country over here. The ideal is like Denmark is its own country, Nigeria is its own country. Maybe a few Nigerians can come in from time to time to visit, but not many, and that's it. That's the ideal, and that's the ideal that most white nationalists. Excuse me, that is the ideal that most white people, in sort of a quote unquote state of nature environment, that is the position that they come to. If white communities are don't have any intervention in terms of their formation of political thought. Now, what happened is mass media that changed all this, because you had a technology, you had a certain window where you had the technology of mass media but not the internet. So if you wanted to be able to get your message out to a large number of people, you had to have a lot of capital. You had to have a lot of access to the machinery of mass media. You had to have access to a big printing press, access to a big radio tower, or access later to a big television tower. And of course, radio and television, that was all licensed by the government. So you had to be politically connected in order to get those things. In order to get radio and television, you had to be politically connected in order to get those licenses. I think you also had to be approved by the government to even have a newspaper license. So in addition to the machinery, the infrastructure needed to print newspapers, you also had to be politically approved as well, right? And so it was all a heavily controlled media environment. That's the mass media. Now, what kind of views were foisted upon the public by this mass media? And the answer is obvious. Okay, basically the views of the mid 1990s, which is sort of the peak of I think of the influence of mass media. That's what you would expect. And one thing so what happened is you had whites, when they're not influenced by mass media, right? Even into the mid 40s, of course, mass media was starting to take hold, but it wasn't anywhere near what it is today. Mass media came into existence and when it came into existence and when it had a big impact, it caused white people to no longer be white nationalists. It caused white people to be, to say all this stupid shit, to say things like, oh, blah, 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 color or character, content or skin, right, shit like that. And that's what you get with the mass media. And so you have whites prior to having all their information controlled, and of course their information in whites today, it was probably like at its worst in the mid 90s prior to the internet, because you had whites. First, they had all the public school. They had the public school system. Okay, so in kindergarten they're being taught, they're being taught tolerance and diversity. Then once they get older, they're taught about the crimes of white people. And then once they get into college, that's when you get the real heavy shit. That's when you get, if you're white, your voice is illegitimate. If you're white, your perspective is illegitimate because you are you are inherently unable to understand what's going on in the world because you are an oppressor class. Everything you have comes from the oppression of others, right? And it seems kind of crazy when you're given to a lot of people who aren't fully fed the anti-white doctrine. They're only fed a little bit of anti-white doctrine, and so they're like, yeah, I'm sorry for slavery, I'm sorry for segregation, but that's over, we did that, let's move on. So that's somebody who's imbibed a little bit of anti-white doctrine, right? They don't fully understand what was going on in segregation, that you had whites who wanted to have their own country, but and a whole bunch of asshole blacks that kept trying to get in, right? They don't realize that that's what was actually happening, right? But they think, so that's a little bit of an anti-white. They've imbibed a little bit of the anti-whiteness there, or for example on slavery, they don't realize that whites were just buying slaves, that these blacks would have been slaves anyway. Their standard of living improved from living in Americas, and of course it was white people who ultimately ended slavery. So white people have nothing to apologize in terms of slavery, right? Because white people's actions did not cause any blacks to be slaves, and ultimately ended slavery and made everybody better off. And made all the blacks better off. So, but of course there's and I have articles where I argue that line and verse, using more statistics and stuff. But that's these are anti-white tropes, and most people have adopted those two anti-white tropes. That's sort of like the basic anti-white trope that people get is that they need to apologize for slavery, and that they need to apologize for segregation, or that that segregation was some bad thing that white people should be sorry for. Right? Those are the two main tropes. When really segregation was just an attempt for a nation to control its borders. When an imperial power wouldn't let it have a country. That's all segregation was. But I'm going far afield. I'm sort of rambling in all these different directions. BitChute. When BitChute starts to get big and the white nationalists start to take over, there's sort of a question here is are you willing to let that happen? Are you going to drop the censorship hammer? Because I see, like for example, I can imagine what the guys at VidMe are thinking with their site. They're thinking, oh, we're going to have all these videos on our site, and we're going to allow free speech, and you know what? We'll even allow white nationalist speech, but it'll be white nationalist speech off in its little corner. But guess what? If you're not doing anything to censor it, if you're not doing anything to suppress it, it will rise just as surely as the quote-unquote alt-right rose. Okay? Because look, we saw what white people were before mass media. They were all white nationalists. Then mass media came about. This conditioned whites to no longer be white nationalists. Now, right, and step 3 is remove the mass media and also sort of remove the sanctity of the universities. People, more people are going to universities, but I think fewer whites as a proportion are going, and they're taking the dew is off the rose a little bit for the universities in terms of their social science stuff. But anyway, so you have. Okay, so think of it in three acts here. You have Act 1, no mass media. white people are all white nationalists, basically like 80% or something. Act 2, the rise of mass media. Mass media rises, whites become no longer white nationalist. Act 3, mass media is starting to be removed and is being replaced by the internet, which emulates the folk political environment that existed prior to mass media. What do you think is going to happen regarding the political views of white people? Like, it's pretty obvious. And I recall like something said by one of the founders of Twitter. He was lamenting how he thought, when you have Twitter, you're going to have a rise of this free speech and it's going to be wonderful and everything. But what ended up happening is Twitter basically was just an enabler for what he called hate speech. Now, what is hate speech? That's like, what did the communists call the thing that they hated? They called it, they had all sorts of names for it. They called it enemy of the revolution, counter-revolutionary, whatever. They had their terms. Middle Ages, heretic, apostate. Okay, and here in the U.S. it's racist, it's hate speech. But basically, yeah, like in a free, in an uncontrolled environment, yeah, you're going to have a rise of heresy and atheism, and you're going to have a rise of quote unquote hate speech. Okay, you're going to have a rise of you're going to have a rise of the kinds of views that existed prior to a controlled media environment. Right? This is something that the guy at Twitter didn't understand. Like I guess he was thinking that racism is a conditioned. No, it's not. It is a natural thing. The conditioning has to be done to suppress it, and once you remove the organs of suppression of those of natural, healthy racial consciousness, once you remove the suppressing mechanisms, like, what's going to happen? Do I even need to say it? Do I even need to say what's going to happen? Or let me ask you this, do I even need to say what is happening? Do I even need to point to the rise of the quote-unquote alt-right? Do I even need to point to the rise of the quote-unquote alt-light? Right? And people talk about the alt-light, they show on the look, the alt-light is sort of people tending towards racial consciousness. At the very least, they're starting to deconstruct the anti-white myths. Right? And an alt-light person, you could go to an alt-light person and argue sort of a kind of a red pill view of segregation and even a red pill view of slavery, that whites, that the net effect of slavery, actually benefited the blacks. Like an alt-light person, may go, oh, that's kind of edgy, but he's not going to be totally close to that. Okay, so you could break down those things with an alt-light person. Now he sort of has a line in his head, of outright racial consciousness. That's like the bridge too far for him. At least publicly, I suspect a lot of these alt-right people are actually, full-on white nationalists in private. Stefan Molyneux. Stefan Molyneux is basically, he's basically a full-on white nationalist right now. He's like, he doesn't even really seem to be hiding it at this point. He's just like, he's just a hop, skip, and a jump from racial holy war at this point. But yeah, so when these people do like a new social network, and the idea of the new social network is free speech, it's like, do you know what that means? Right? It means white nationalism wins. And so you have this new social network. Are you prepared for white nationalism to win? Because look, that's what happens when you don't have a controlled media environment. White nationalism wins among whites, okay? Like, this is so like, because I hear all this sort of fluffy language about free speech. It's like, and okay, yeah, like across time and history, you could talk about the principles of free speech in kind of this abstract way, but at any specific point in time, Free speech is about a particular thing, right? In medieval Europe, it was about Christian doctrine. In the Soviet Union, it was about, Soviet stuff. It was about communism it was about the free market, right? Medieval Europe is about atheism, okay? You can find other examples. In the Islamic world, it's about Islam and apostasy and stuff like that, okay? In China, they have their own things that you can't say in China. So, but today in the U.S., it's about white nationalism. Okay, that's what it's about. So to be for free speech in any meaningful way, what it means is white nationalism wins, right? Because to be free, talk about UFOs or Bigfoot or whatever, it's like, yeah, cool. No, nobody cares. That's not being censored. That's not, you say, oh, I'm allowing that to have a platform. It's like, yeah, shut up. Like, nobody cares about Bigfoot, okay? It's about white nationalism. Okay, that's what this is about. That's what free speech is about, okay? Okay, so in order to promote free speech in a substantive way, one, it has to be about you have to platform white nationalism, okay? That's free speech in any meaningful sense today in the U.S. If it was the Soviet Union, it would be about platforming free market capitalist ideas. But today in the U.S., substantive free speech means platforming white nationalism. That's what it means. All right. It doesn't mean Bigfoot. Doesn't mean UFOs. It doesn't mean 9/11 truth or shit. It doesn't mean false flag conspiracy shit. Right. It means white nationalism. Okay. That's what matters. That's what's going to gain ground. Okay. And two, it means if you want to keep doing this, it means letting white nationalism win, because white nationalism will win if there's no strictures against it. Okay? White nationalism will win if there's no strictures against it. Because we know when in the past, when there were no strictures against white nationalism, that's exactly what whites did. Okay? It takes some sort of external control of particular groups and it takes particular groups controlling the organs of influence, be it the church, the universities, the media. That's what it takes to get whites to not be white nationalists. It takes a certain group of people. You can call them Jews, or you can call them the elites, or you can call them whatever you want to call them. It doesn't really matter. Like we know that the kinds of people that run the universities and run mass media are different from the people who don't. That's all that matters. Jews, whatever. Sure, they're Jews. They're 50% Jewish. That's probably shitty. But if you break down that, like that's sort of a funny thing. Is you break down mass media influence, you're in effect breaking down Jewish influence, which is which is kind of it's kind of true to the extent that Jews disproportionately control mass media. That's what you're going to be doing. If Mormons disproportionately controlled mass media, it would be breaking down mass media would be breaking down Mormon influence. So it's just a sort of an analytic truth. So that's what I have to say about that. So for the founder of BitChute, if you're doing the free speech thing, are you really? Are you really doing this? Because if you're really doing this, it means white nationalism. It means white nationalism wins. Okay? And don't, and you need to sort of make a decision right now. Are you going to let this play out? If you let white nationalists come onto your site and start doing all the white nationalist stuff and start winning and start taking over, are you going to put a stop to it and say, well, I support free speech, but within limits, within constraints, within blah, 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 blah. That's like the Soviet Union, because I'm going, I support free speech, but now that we have these free market capitalist ideas and they're starting to actually win out, now I'm going to put limits on, then it doesn't mean anything, right? The point of free speech is that the ideas win. The idea is that something else wins and becomes the new status quo. That's the point. Right? The point isn't just to have some people to have their little, chat box where they can talk to each other, in their own solipsistic little corners and and share ideas with each other. Like, that's like, no, the point is that it has teeth. The point is that it wins. Okay? And the point of free speech in the United States, right? Not talking about the greater principles and the more abstract principles and the rights of free speech and classical liberals. I'm not talking about any of that. I'm saying in the here and now, when the rubber hits the road, free speech is about white nationalism winning. Free speech is about white nationalism winning. That's practically what it means in the United States today. Particular, like the specific historical reality is that free speech means white nationalism wins. That's what it means. Okay? Because when you start allowing all the substantive avenues of free speech, right? That is, they are legally allowed to speak. They are allowed to have a platform, meaning that they can talk to lots of other people, that they're not barred from having a large platform, a large following where they make videos, they get hundreds of thousands of people listening to them, right? If they're not barred from these things, they're gonna win, and they are winning, right? That's what's happening on the internet. That's why it's happening more on the internet than outside the internet, because the internet more closely approximates the kind of media environment that existed prior to mass media. Okay, so that's, I guess sort of the little rant I wanted to do, talking about free speech and talking about these free speech platforms. Because I could very much see VidMe, saying, oh yes, we'll allow white nationalists to have their speech. But then, what happens? White nationalists start taking over the site, and then VidMe starts to go, oh, maybe we need to have some limits on free speech, but right? Because they don't understand. They are not aware of the political environment that they're in. They're not aware that all this non-white nationalist stuff is simply a function of a conditioning. Is simply a function. They are confusing these highly processed, these highly synthetic views that most white people have. Tolerance and diversity, anti-racism, and content is skin and color of character, that kind of crap. Right? They're confusing these for reality. Right? They're confusing these shitty multiracialist platitudes with reality. They don't realize that that's all just a function. That's a function of a very intense conditioning process that began in kindergarten. And when you start to, Alex Jones, break the conditioning, what's going to come? Like the white nationalist stuff. That's the real view. That's the real stuff that wins out in a free speech environment. Okay, and so what people are doing is they're confused. They're taking this diversity crap, and multiracialist crap and white guilt crap. They're taking it too seriously. They think that's the real thing. No, that's not the real thing. That's the party doctrine. That's the commie shit, okay? That's the Catholic Church shit. That's the Muslim shit. That's the bugaboo. That's the bugaboo of the day. That's not real. That's the regime. That's the regime flavor. That's the flavor of the current regime, okay? So I guess that's sort of my little rant I wanted to do here. I'm a little bit under the weather, and so I didn't want to. But I said on my YouTube channel that I make a video. I'm going to make a long video on Sunday. Made a video response to Richard Spencer on Saturday, so I'm basically making videos back to back. And so this thing is not going to be very good. It's more of just sort of a long rant. But I promised, and I want to commit to this schedule. I've committed to it this will be the third week that I've committed to it, so I'm having a good track record on this, sort of getting back into the sort of regularity that I had on producing video content back in the anarchist days, and I think I'm doing that here, and so that's why I made this video, but it's not. I don't think this is the best video. It's more of like a rant about the alternative media and the ultimate. I guess my sort of triumphalist theory about the rise of white nationalism. But yeah, I just wanted to put this out there because, I said on my channel, Tuesday, Thursday, Sunday, and so it's Sunday, put it up, fuckface, and so I put something up. And this is what I'm putting up.